And now we have Chibnall's most recent story, which serves as a contrasting sequel to his previous one. Where Dinosaurs on a Spaceship was all about watching the Doctor and friends in a thoroughly ridiculous, straightforward situation that is his element, The Power of Three centers around the Doctor trying to live a day in his friends' lives, with the catalyst being an alien invasion that couldn't be less straightforward. The whole world is, overnight, populated with billions of identical black cubes that don't seem to do anything. The TARDIS crew is naturally very wary, however, and the Doctor elects to stick around Earth for a while and see what their deal is. Well, that's only sort of true. The story of Power 3 isn't really about the cubes, it's about Amy and Rory's conflict of staying with the Doctor or staying on Earth, something which has been seeded throughout the preceding 3 episodes. The cubes are really just a conceit to allow us to stay on Earth so that internal struggle can be shown, and also be a relatively new and unexplored sci-fi idea as a bonus. The Doctor's actions cement this as he does everything he can to be with his best friends throughout the episode. At first he finds watching the cubes for days on end unbelievably dull and is constantly poking at Amy and Rory to come along with him on more trips. This only serves to feed their internal conflict as the adventures they go on prove to be initially appealing but ultimately botched. I also think it's a subtle and probably unintentional bit of irony that Amy and Rory's growth into better, more mature people thanks to their travels with the Doctor is really what's allowing them to make the connections that keep them tied to Earth in this episode. I mean, if you think about it, they started their time on the show as a socially maladjusted thrill-seeker and a slightly dopey doormat, but over the course of their adventures have come to be the kind of totally dependable and proactive people who would naturally have amazing lives if they were to stick around on Earth. The episode also does a good job selling me on the idea that Amy and Rory want that kind of life. I mean, Amy used to be a kissogram, a job that hardly qualifies as one. The fact that she spent all of Series 7 going through careers like a madwoman proves that she's at least trying to find something stable. There's also the fact that, consciously or not, Amy and Rory both refer to life on Earth as real life. Obviously, that's a life they've ultimately spent more time in, and even after years of traveling in the TARDIS, the adventures they go on are probably too fantastical for anyone to consider real. But the fact that they both indirectly assign the status of unreal to their time with the Doctor makes it appear as though they view it as ephemeral, as something with an expiration date. Had I not known going into this episode that Amy and Rory would have at least one more under their belt, I think I would have been unsure what decision they'd ultimately come to. When the Doctor decides to stay on Earth again, for weeks this time, the cubes take a backseat to just spending time with Amy and Rory on their own terms. The Doctor is placing the decision of what to do with themselves firmly in their own hands, and when they decide to stick with him by the end of the story, it's such a cathartic moment. Getting back to what I said about the cubes being an interesting concept, I think Power 3 best displays Chibnall's capacity for creative ideas. The idea of a living sun lashing out like a frightened animal was unique enough, but in execution it wasn't that different from any other possession plot. The plot skeleton of the Silurian two-parter is often called a beat-for-beat retread of the Silurians' debut, and the meat of the plot for the last episode came a bit too late into the runtime to be notable amongst all the other elements of the writing. By contrast, the idea of these small, innocuous alien objects appearing on Earth and just sitting there isn't the type of idea I've ever seen. I know I said at the start of this whole thing that I can prefer a derivative idea to an original one so long as the execution is better, but I think Power of 3 has that going for it as well. As was implied, what makes the cubes interesting is how people react to them, as in the context of the story, they were made to be reacted to. Their whole MO is seeding themselves into everyday life and then gathering attention just when they become entirely commonplace. I don't doubt for a second that this is almost exactly how the real world would react to these things if they showed up either. I also can't help but dig the character contrast that's made clear by the end of the episode. The Doctor and the Shakri are both alien presences that have to sit still on Earth, but because of their inherent natures and motivations, one succeeds where the other fails. If there's one thing that could foil a character as dynamic and proactive as the Doctor, especially the 11th, it's a featureless, inanimate object. Can I also just say I love the Murray Gold score for this episode? It almost reminds me a bit of the classic series, with a mostly understated but very off-kilter vibe, and not the type of thing you usually hear from this show. Brian's back, and he's as fun as ever. His mind was noticeably opened over the course of Dinosaurs on a Spaceship, and I think that shows in his wild theories about the cubes in this episode. However, he's also a mundane guy at heart, and I like to think that gives him some perspective on Amy and Rory's dilemma that neither they nor the Doctor have. I think it says a lot that he voices the Pond's decision for them at the end.
Isn't it?
I've got my job.
Oh, yes, Rory. The universe is awaiting, but you have a little job to
It's
go
not little, it's important to me. Look, what you do isn't all there is.
Ah, gorgeous Rory. Speaking of perspective, the Doctor and Rory have always had clashing perspectives ever since the day they met, and I think that's part of why I find him such a brilliant companion. All of the modern companions have been willing to challenge the Doctor on things, but so often it's overwrought or goes on too long to not feel like TV drama. This story and the previous two I've looked at really displays how well Chibnall gets a dynamic between these two characters. Great friends, but often opposed in what they value. Unlike other companions, when Rory gives the Doctor a reality check, even in non-Chibnall episodes, it doesn't feel like we had to regress or otherwise change the Doctor's character to get to that point. I guess the best way to put it is that whenever the two have a big disagreement, it always comes as a natural result of consistently opposing philosophies, and not as a result of happenstances limited to a single story. The Doctor's relationship with Amy is just as dynamic, if a bit simpler, and together the two of them have the best scene in the episode, which we need to talk about right now.
Well, our lives have changed so much. Well, there was a time, there were years, when I couldn't live without you. When just the whole everyday thing would drive me crazy. But since you dropped us back here, since you gave us this house, we built a life. But I don't know if I can have both.
Why?
Because they pull at each other. Because they pull at me, and because the traveling is starting to feel like running away.
That's not what it is.
Oh, come on, look at you 4 days in a lounge and you go crazy.
I'm not running away. But this is one corner of one country and one continent on one planet that's a corner of a galaxy, that's a corner of a universe that is forever growing and shrinking and creating and destroying and never remaining the same for a single millisecond. And there is so much to see, Amy. Because it goes so fast. I'm not running away from things, I'm running to them before they flare and fade forever.
This scene, in my mind, is why Chibnall wasn't just a good choice for showrunner, but a perfect choice for showrunner. This guy has a singular vision of who the Doctor is that I can really get behind. Probably more so than the vision that either Russell T Davies or Stephen Moffat had for the character. Davies painted the Doctor as a lonely god, a man surrounded by tragedy who tried to put on the front of an ideal hero despite the fact that the universe seemed out to get him. Moffat's Doctor is the ideal hero, the man with all the power, all the clout, and all the pull you could possibly want, but in a constant struggle not to let himself get deconstructed by going too far. Looking back at all the episodes I've reviewed, it's clear to me who Chibnall's Doctor is. He's a man driven by curiosity before anything else. A man who wants to see every interesting thing there is to see and is characterized first and foremost by pure, unbridled enthusiasm. In the Doctor's own words, he's a creature of hope, the type of guy who's excited to learn, always asking questions, always moving on to the next big thing, and always finding some little thing to be fascinated by. Sometimes, not often, but sometimes, it's easy to forget watching this show that the reason the Doctor does what he does isn't that of some grander goal or to run away from fear of something, but simply because traveling in time and space is something he enjoys. I don't know about you guys, but the fact that Chibnall gets this so well is more than enough for me to be excited for his take on the series. Something else of note is that this story is the debut of now recurring character Kate Lethbridge-Stewart, and looking back, I think this is easily Jimmer Redgrave's best performance as a character. She's just a lot more expressive and less jaded than she becomes later on. Saving what I think of her in general for a later time, I think she's an endearing presence in this story. My biggest complaint with this story on initial viewing, and everyone's really, was that the climax felt really rushed. But looking at it now, I'm not really sure what I'd have changed had I been in Chibnall's position. Yes, the fact that it ultimately comes down to waving the sonic screwdriver at a screen to fix things is a problem. But it's not like it's something that breaks the episode or can even really be classified as a writing mistake. Power of Three is almost the polar opposite to Dinosaurs in a Spaceship in that regard. Dinosaurs was elevated by a really distinct villain presence, whereas with this episode it's the only thing that's really missing. If it isn't already obvious, this is my favorite of Chibnall's Doctor Who stories. The only reason I don't give The Power of Three a 10 instead of a 9 is because I'm making a conscious effort to be more careful with how many of those I give out. Reserved for instant classics only, let's say. PO3 isn't quite that, but I think it's easily the best episode of Series 7, barring Day of the Doctor. As I always say, especially with this show, everything comes down to personal taste. I know there are a bunch of folks who don't care for this episode and who are still opposed to Chibnall taking over the show, but to me personally, Chibnall has proven that he understands what it is about this show that makes it appealing. The biggest problem in any of his stories can be traced back to having to fill time with showrunners' story arcs, and I can't wait to see what he does once he doesn't have that restraint on himself. No offense, Stephen Moffat, I'm sure I'll have a blast with Series 10, but 2018 can't get here fast enough.